such thing as unconscious logic. So we'll see by the end. So here's the big question. What is the nature of unconscious thought? I want to know what unconscious thought is like, and of course that assumes that there is such a thing as unconscious thought. I'm going to take that for granted to start, and then we'll work up to it. And there's really two questions, at least, that I see here. One is, what's the structure of unconscious mental representations? A lot of people will think that there is no such structure. Those people might want to leave right now. And two is, what laws describe the transitions between unconscious thoughts? So I'm going to argue that we can give some real positive answers to both. I'm not, of course, the first person to think that we can. Lots of people think that there's an answer to it. Here are some of them. They're dual process theorists. And these dual process theories, of course, dual process theory could be anything. You know, if you think there are two of them, then you're a dual process theory. I have a specific sort in mind, a specific sort which these fine people generally take on. And the idea is something like, although there are tons of differences between system 1 and system 2, here are the kind of basic similarities. We have, this is coming from Sloman in '96, and although the bells and whistles change every few years, what stays the same is that you have an associative system and a rule-based system. The associative system is something like system 1. It's something more or less unconscious, more or less based on the contiguity between experiences, personal experiences, as they have up there, that you've had, and that the system is associative. It's automatic too. And the idea is that there's some system that you have that works very quickly, it works unconsciously, it works regardless of what you in general think, and that it is dumb. It's just updating associations. And it's coming from this really robust tradition in associationism. It sadly loses a lot of its roots, and so what I'm going to do in this talk is one negative thing and then 1.5 positive things. And the first negative thing is just get clear on what the roots of this associative system are, and to point out that insofar as they really think this is an associative system, they're in some trouble. So here's something that you might remember from a freshman psychology textbook, and it's just your Thorndike or Skinner box. You've got your rat, and the rat's on a grid. The grid's electrified, so you can shock your rat whenever you'd like. And there's a food dispenser and a response lever. Maybe the rat has to push it in order to get food. And then you have your loudspeaker and lights, so you can have an audio-visual stimulus. I want to take a second just for everybody to be incredibly bored while looking at this, because I'm not going to show the picture again, but it's going to come up a lot. What's going to matter is that there's some different variables here, variables where we can set up contingencies, associations between whether a light goes off and you get shocked, or you pushing a button and food coming out. So this sort of setup is the basis, in part, lying a little bit about history, for a really robust theory, and that's the associative theory. And here's some of the really positive features of associationism. First, it's really well defined, and it's fairly well understood. And that is great, because the theory I'm going to be stumping for is kind of neither of those. So associationism has a lot going for it. Here's a kind of basic form of it. You could see this basic form from Hume and maybe Locke all the way through Pavlov and Thorndike, and then it gets a few more bells and whistles after Skinner, but it's more or less the same thing. And the basic form is that more or less the frequency with which an organism has come into a contact with x's and y's, it determines the frequency with which the thoughts about x's and the thoughts about y's will come together. Now, what you want to do if you're an associationist is define the relation of associationism, and the one defined here is something like contiguity, and that relation is supposed to dictate how the things you've come into contact with allow certain things in your mind to come together. And what this gives you is kind of clear functional role. The idea is that the associations arise in this particular way, and then they're modulated in the same way that the good old animal cognition folks thought they were, through counter-conditioning and extinction. So it's a really broad, bold thesis. Here, I was going to make you guess who gave this quote, because it could be from anyone, but instead few seconds ago I wrote down the quote to not be a jerk. Here's the wonderful quote. If our hypothesis as to the origins of the conditioned reflex is correct, it follows that any natural phenomenon chosen at will may be converted into a conditioned stimulus. This has, in effect, been proved to be true. Any visual stimulus, any desired sound, any odor, and the stimulation of any part of the skin, either by mechanical means or by the application of heat or cold, have never failed in our hands to stimulate the salivary glands, although before they were all ineffective for that purpose. And this is, of course, Pavlov. Maybe the salivary glands would have given it away. But let's pretend for a second that you are, back in 1906. This is a really shocking, wonderful thesis, and it's a thesis that's going to do a lot of work. And some of that work is part of the real beauty of associationism. It marries a form of empiricism that for some reason people like to lots of different cognitive actions. So it gives you a theory of learning. How do we learn these things? We learn them based on the experience of what you've seen in your environment. Theory of thinking. How do our thoughts how do we go from one thought to the other? We go from one thought to the other based upon the associative properties, the contiguity of those two thoughts, having experienced them previously. It gives us a theory of mental structure. Question, what is the structure of thought? Answer, it's associative. There is no structure. It's just a bunch of things that are associated with one another. So it's going to elide the thinking and structure. And then for people in the 80s and maybe a few stragglers today, it gives you a theory of the implementation base of thought, something like a connectionist architecture from which you can implement the associative theorizing. This is something that I'm not going to say anything else about the connectionist architecture because there'll be enough confusions to wade our way through. So just a little bit more about these four types. Really what I have in mind with learning is something like associative learning. And that could be classical conditioning, where you have this kind of stimulus substitution paradigm. It could be operant conditioning, if you're trying to generate new behaviors. It could be evaluative conditioning, which is more along the lines of what we see tested in the IIT and what Edouard was talking about earlier, about learning valences. You have associative structures. These are ideally symmetric, although the ideally part's going to get thrown out the window. And they're just the normal things that you test for in a lexical decision task, whether salt leads activations of salt concepts lead to activations of the pepper concept. Shock, it does. Same thing with insects and microphones and bugs and yes, shockingly. Note that if insects leads to microphones, that should be surprising because insects and microphones have nothing to do with each other, but they go through a non-rational route going through bugs because bugs has these two meanings, and that's the sort of dumb associative process we're looking at. And if you have this associative theory, you can do what James might have wanted to do. I'm not a James scholar, but he talks about associative trains of thought. And you might think that we want an associative theory to do this. Maybe you don't like associative structures and you want there to be some propositional structures. Nevertheless, we need to explain the transitions from some of those thoughts to others. You might think, for example, that it's 3 p.m. and so you should have a beer. There might not be a rational relation between them. It might just be that you have a beer every time it's 3 p.m. And that would be perhaps an associative relation between two propositional structures. And then again, you might have this associative implementation base. And these can be mixed and matched. So you don't need to be a pure associationist. But I'm going to posit the pure associationist as an opponent to knock down. And then I'll get clearer about what actual people's views are. The reason why I'm going to posit a pure associationist is that, in fact, there are a lot of them. And shockingly, they appear in social psychology, places where, in fact, people are not thinking about things in these terms. They just take on associative theory. And then later on, we can get clearer on which ones of these things I think actually do coexist in the mind. But I'll just say up front, thinking that there's unconscious logic and unconscious structured representations is not to deny that there are also associative properties to thoughts. I think that would be a shockingly strong thesis and one that I am not going to take on. It might instead be best to say that maybe associative learning is not doing the majority of learning, but that's not to deny that there's not such a thing as associative learning. Okay, so what ties these together? It's some sort of commitment to a certain irrationality of thought that we've seen bubbling up. And the idea is that mental states M1 and M2 are associated if and only if they satisfy a certain causal historical fact. The fact that the contents that M1 and M2 represent have been experienced in your environment. And having them associated just entails that if you activate one, ceteris paribus, the other one will become activated regardless of their semantic or logical relations. So if for some reason you associate peanut butter and corn, then having corn activated will bring to mind peanut butter and vice versa. Even though those are, kind of disgusting to put together, if they're associated, that's what you get. All right. There are a lot of problems with this really basic view, and I am going to bore at least Sue by going through some of them. Here's the negative part of the talk. And, if everybody just says uncle at the same time, I'll skip it. Here are some of its very well understood problems. For more of them, feel free to email me, and you'll get a very long email in response. So here's one thing that is generally predicted by associative theory, that learning speed should be gradual, but in fact, learning speed appears to be abrupt. So here, if you just look in your general conditioning or intro to psych book, you'll see a curve like this that plots something like mean responses versus sessions. All you're getting is plotting a behavior over time. This is taken from Gall's till 2004. And look, it looks like a pretty slow learning curve. A steady curve where the animal's learning slowly over time, and that looks pretty good. It looks like gradual learning. Here is the fine print. Learning curve shown as a group of 20 pigeons. That is not a single pigeon. How does a single pigeon learn? Oh, here's how a single pigeon learns. Look what it does for its first 40 pecks. Nothing. It does nothing. And then once it figures out by pecking it, it's going to get some food. What does it do? It goes up to criterion. What happens when you look at a bunch of these different curves? Well, let's do that. Let's plot each individual pigeon. And what you'll see is, oh man, it's just a random function of when they start going to actually hit whatever the criterion is. So this was an auto-shaping trial. But what you see is, your first pigeon gets there pretty quickly, and then, this pigeon, it took them a while to get there, and this pigeon, somewhere in between. And if you sum over these curves, you get what looks to be a slow, gradual curve. But in fact, you don't have any slow, gradual curve. You have more or less one-shot learning. That's not to say that once we hit criterion, we're done. These are asymptotically unstable. So once you hit criterion, a lot of times they just drop back down and stop doing the behavior. Let's put it in human terms and see what that would mean. You might find out that by, making a certain type of joke, you would make your partner laugh, and then you would make this joke a lot to make your partner laugh, but then you might get bored about it, or you might want to do something else, or you might not care about your partner, or you might think about, maybe you want some food, and then you'd stop doing it. We would say that your behavior is too asymptotically unstable. And so without giving lots of other mental states to these pigeons, let's just say that once they hit criterion, they don't spend the rest of their life just pecking away with whatever we asked them to peck at. But that doesn't mean that the learning was gradual. And it's not just about pigeons. You can see this in word learning. I'm going to say very little about this since Sue's talking next and should surely say something here. Let's just say that there is one-shot learning of words in human children too. And then there's a lot of things that look like they're extra add-ons for such learning to happen. So Lila Gleitman has a theory of syntactic bootstrapping, and that's the idea that, let's just say, you need more than basic contiguity features of experience in order to understand how certain words work. You might think that chase and flee, that every chasing scenario is a fleeing scenario. Then how are you going to learn which one's chasing and which one's fleeing? Lila's answer is it's going to have something to do with syntax, which is not basic, built into the basic associative theory. Same thing you can see in syntactic category learning. I picked these citations. I could have picked a whole different slew of citations. Here's the general idea of the first 100 words that children learn. Most of them are nouns. Very few of them are verbs. None of them are things like the and never mind adjectives or adverbs, even though they hear those. You hear things like, are you tired? Baby want a ball. And these will have, two nouns and a verb, but now verbs are not produced. So whatever is actually being produced isn't mirroring the contingencies which the organism is experiencing. So if associative theory is going to work, it's going to have to do a lot of explaining away of what look to be the learning curves and the specifics of learning. Remember that quote before of any stimulus? Well, maybe not any stimulus. And why not? Because there are also very well-known domain-specific constraints on learning. If I were in a crowd of animal cognition folks, I would never have the next few slides. But because we're talking to social psychologists, apparently we need these. So here's some old news. Rats are prepared to associate an audiovisual stimulus with a shock. That was what we saw in that earlier Skinner box. What that means is you can get rats to learn that when they see a light or see a light and hear a sound, that they're going to get shocked. They're pretty good at that. Here is something that they're not prepared to learn. That if you associate, you could feel a shock and associate that with a gustatory stimulus. So they're contra-prepared to have, sorry, that shouldn't say shock. That should say a shock with a gustatory stimulus here. So even in perfect contiguity, what this means is if you shock them and they feel nauseous, they won't associate the shock with the nausea. They won't associate a light with the nausea. Instead, they're prepared to associate a gustatory stimulus with nausea, just meaning the last taste of something they ate, they'll associate with the feeling of getting nauseous. But they're contra-prepared to associate nausea with an audiovisual stimulus. So if every time they get nauseous, you show them lights and you show them sounds, they won't associate the lights and sounds with getting sick. And this is, of course, the same for humans. So let's take a second to just see what's happening. If you drink a lot of vodka tonight, you won't get sick the moment that you're drinking vodka, unless you drink a lot of vodka in that setting. You'll get sick a few hours later. But when you get sick, you won't associate that sickness with wherever you are. Let's say that you are in the hotel lobby. It's not like you're going to think, oh, the hotel lobby made me sick. It's in fact the last taste that you had that you'll associate, that's the gustatory stimulus, with the feeling of nausea. The contiguity would be of the things that you're perceiving at the moment. But in fact, contiguity is not necessary. You can have these taste aversions take up to 12 hours between getting sick and associating with the last thing you ate. So it looks like contiguity isn't necessary for this, and that there are domain-specific biases in learning what will associate with what. And by the way, even though we're similar to rats here, chickens are different. So chickens you can condition to associate the look, the actual color of what they're eating with feeling sick, as opposed to the taste of it. And if you weren't a hardcore empiricist, you might have some explanations for why this is. But we don't need to just look at taste aversions. There are even more problems, and that's that contiguity isn't sufficient for association. There's this phenomenon called blocking. So here we go. Let's say you have an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group is going to get light and a shock in T1, so the light predicts the shock. And then at T2, it gets light and a tone and a shock. Now you can run T2 for as long as you like, so that the shock is always going with the tone. As long as it learned that the light is going with the tone, the organism won't learn that the tone is predicting the shock. So the idea is just that the tone's being blocked by the light, even if it's in perfect contiguity. And there's still more problems. This one is a variation of it. If your CS predicts your US, but your US isn't in perfect contiguity to CS, you're going to get some weird learning. So here's one way of showing it. Let's say your light's O is in perfect contiguity with your shock, then your rat will take the light to predict the shock. But let's say that your light is not in perfect contiguity with the shock. Let's say it's 20% or less. Then the rat won't associate the light with the shock, but it won't form no associations. It'll associate the cage with the shock. But of course, the cage is there in all the other trials. So you might think, why isn't the cage being associated elsewhere? In some, what's happening is these rats aren't dumb. What they're doing is figuring out that CSs predict CRs only when the CSs are predictive. Right? They're trying to figure out what's predictive in their environment, and they're updating on what's predictive. Note that what's been implicit in here is some kind of deeper problems with associative theory. One problem is this just general problem of coextensionality. How do you predict of all the things that are coextensional with the situation in which the learning is happening, which ones will be learned? If you just thought it's the properties that are coextensive with the learning situation, then you'd have to explain why the cage isn't being learned on every time. Or maybe why it's, the day of the week's not being learned, or the location on the map. All the things that are coextensive in the learning situation should, in theory, be picked up, but of course they're not. There's also this deeper problem. It's the problem of predication, and you could see this for humans pretty well. If you just think that thinking that two thoughts associated with each other is the equivalent of thinking that there's some predication, then you've got an odd view of the mind. Me thinking that chair is red is not me thinking chair and red in succession. One of those tells you that I have two thoughts, one that's chair and one that's red. The other one tells you that I think a specific thing about the chair. So Pache dual process theories. We've got some reason to search for accounts that aren't just associative. I know this now puts me on a bizarre island, but it is the correct island to be on. And if you're not happy with these 75 arguments, I've got another 150 data points in my back pocket. Instead, let's go to some positive theory, and that's a theory of mental logic. Associationism, again, really well understood, but the logical and conscious thought, that's not really well understood at all. Here's one thing we know, that whatever first-order logic is probably isn't the logic of thought. It would be awesome if it was, because then I could say something about it. But instead, we've got this other program, and it's a program of trying to figure out how unconscious thought works if it's not basic associations. So, what would it mean to say that there's unconscious mental logic? I think, and here's the kind of real push for the positive part, it would be to show at least two things. One is that there are propositionally structured representations. Two is that there are some transformations of those representations that obey some logical rules or other. Note that those logical rules might not be respectable, they might not be normatively respectable, but they better be something like formal in their nature. And these rules, of course, needn't be explicitly represented for basic Lewis Carroll reasons. So, what would an unconscious rule be? It would be a rule that would have to be built into the architecture. Here's an operationalization or characterization of what it takes a rule to be built into the architecture to amount to. It should amount to that when the triggering conditions of the process or rules met, the process must begin and can only be stopped by variables roughly one level below the intentional psychological level, the level at which the rule is pitched. So the idea is that the rule has two properties. One is automaticity. The rule must start in the conditions in which it says it should start. And two is something like bullisticity, that it has to keep its processing unless something else is happening. So the idea is that you can't choose to not have this happen. You can't have just attentional task demands knock it down. It has to be that you have some actual, roughly neurological deficit that stops it. So, the rest of the talk will be me arguing that, in fact, we have some reason to think that there are these things. Here's some evidence for structured representations. There's a very, very old argument that's been given for a long time by this Fodor guy about the productivity and systematicity of thought. I'm not going to touch that. Do note that it's an argument, and it's an argument that people have to respond to, but it's not my argument. I'm just going to mention I am aware of its existence. There's also this thing called psycholinguistics, and I'm also aware of its existence, and I think a lot of people pretend like they're not. So I'm just going to say really quickly, if you want to be associationist, that you have to at least explain how the following comes up. If you give people the sentence surgeons or butchers, and this is just some example I'm pulling, I could have pulled any example, I'd say it's random. It's not totally random. So surgeons or butchers will prime clumsy, and this makes sense. Pache, some of the things that Tim was saying before, it makes sense because, surgeons or butchers is to sort of say clumsy. And note that none of those words, surgeons nor butchers, actually entail clumsy, so it's not that it's semantically related, it's that the meaning of the sentence leads to it. Well, here's the fun thing. If you give people the sentence surgeons aren't butchers, you prime both clumsy and precise. But of course, clumsy isn't related to surgeons aren't butchers. Why is this coming up? Here's why it's coming up, because when you're forming the sentence, when you're parsing it, you first form the affirmative, surgeons are butchers. And look, that causes the original prime. Then you add the negation. From the value of that whole proposition, you get both. So look, this looks to be structured. It at least prima facie does. If you want to reject structured representations, you're going to have to talk to psycholinguists. All right, some other evidence. There's a ton of evidence I've talked about elsewhere, and frankly, a lot of you have seen in some form or other. So I'm not going to go through it, about why you should take the implicit attitude literature to push for actually there being structured representations. In that newspaper in 2015, I go through a bunch of them. I won't go through any of those. And because it's been coming up, if you want to know why I think they're beliefs, go one paper back. I'm not going to talk about beliefs beyond that. It's been beat up elsewhere. But I will say...
A hint about what this is about for those of us who haven't seen it.
Sure. 2015 is just... I'll do one better. I'll give you another example that's just like it, that's just not gone over elsewhere, because there are too many for it. 2014 is just an argument that these things are beliefs, and that'll take us a little bit longer, though I think Ned's heard a lot of that argument. So just to let you know where we are, sure, you can do it with IATs, but you can do what I'm going to say with anything. So I like the next study because, Pache, some of what Edward was saying, you run this with AMP or an IAT or any priming and you get the same results. So this is the only study I will run through to push that these things aren't associative. Bear with me because you're going to play along with this. And it's not going to be a race-based thing, so you won't have to feel bad about yourself. This just came out last month from Mann and Ferguson. Melissa Ferguson's done some really interesting work on this, and I'm very happy to be able to share it with you. And here's what you get. It's a story just about somebody, a fictional character, who's ransacking a house. There's the character. His face is going to be on every slide. This isn't actually the face that you see. I just pulled another white guy with a neutral expression. So, just like the subjects in this experiment, I'm going to give you the sentences one at a time, and you are going to read them. And then, I know it's been a long day, and there's been a lot of people talking at you, and I'm particularly loud, but do your best to try to think through what's happening. There are 27 of these sentences. There are 2 houses that are ransacked. Because I'd prefer not to bore the hell out of you, I'll only give you the first half of them, and that'll be enough to, I think, set the mood. Here we go. Francis West is the person up here. Francis's small town was about 99% white, but recently, the Griffins and Wards, the town's first ever interracial families, have moved in. Francis West knew that the couples that owned the other 2 homes on the street, the Griffins and Wards, had gone out for a bit. After a few minutes, he looked out the window at the Griffins' house and decided that he just had to go over there. Francis grabbed an axe from his cellar and went across the backyard to the Griffins' porch door. He started hacking away at the door, cursing and occasionally kicking as the door groaned and finally yielded under the force of Francis's blows. The door splintered into a million pieces, ruining a tiny painting of a butterfly that the Griffiths' daughter, Zoe, had painted on its lower left corner only days before. Treading mud onto the Griffins' freshly installed beige carpet, Francis made his way through the family room of the home. As he went, Francis knocked over and shattered a set of priceless vases handed down to Mrs. Griffin by her grandmother. The pieces scattered on the floor, mixing with the mud from Francis's boots. As he entered the kitchen, Francis spotted a large pot full of water sitting on top of the stove. He grabbed the pot and proceeded to throw the water all over the kitchen, drenching and destroying Zoe's first laptop, which was sitting on the countertop. Francis took the pot with him as he moved on into the stairwell to the second floor, throwing the remaining water all over the hallway. Much of it doused a painting that Mrs. Griffin's mother had made for her years before her passing. It was Mrs. Griffin's favorite. As Francis arrived at the second floor, he methodically searched the bedroom for precious things, stomping all over pictures that young Zoe had left on the floor by the top of the stairs. Francis did not even care. Francis found what he was looking for and left the house with it. Okay, there's another 13 of these. He does the same thing in the Ward's house. just take a moment to think about how unbelievably terrible this story is. Great! Now, Edward, I just picked this one for the hell of it. Here's the amp. I could have picked the IT. It's the same. Here's how the amp works. First, you get a fixation for 100 milliseconds. Then I've just planted that fake face in. 75 milliseconds, you see this face. And so 75 milliseconds is enough for you to process the face. But then, and in fact, most people claim that they process it consciously, so at least Payne would think that this is conscious. It doesn't matter for here. Blank screen for 125 milliseconds. Then you see a Chinese character. Of course, anybody who knows Chinese is not allowed to partake in the study. And then you're just asked to rate how much you like this character. Okay. Here are a few things. First of all, does anybody in here think that you would come out of the story liking Francis so far? Of course not. And so what happens here is just this normal way of doing it. When people see Francis's face, they rate the character worse. When they see other faces that aren't Francis, they rate the character better. You do the same thing with the IIT. I think I have one of those slides just thrown in later on. And in fact, they do. Okay, now we're going to split you up into 3 conditions. Control condition gets one more sentence. Let's say you're in the control condition. Here you go. While he waited on the sidewalk to confront the Wards and Griffiths, Francis started picking up rocks from the roadside and hurling them at the houses. By the time the horrified families returned, nearly all of the windows had been smashed by rocks, and dents covered the front of both houses. Great, now you take the amp again, or the IIT again, and what do you think happens? You still hate him. Maybe you hate him a little bit more. Okay. Now there are people in this other condition. Let's call it the exonerating condition. Francis West broke into the adjoining Griffin and Ward homes because he saw that they were on fire. The only precious things he removed from either home were the young kids, Zoe and Mark, and he waited on the sidewalk for them until their worried parents returned. Or, and this will just be for fun, this one makes me very happy, you could be in the second control condition. So condition 1 was the control condition we saw before. Condition 2 is this one, the exonerating condition. Condition 3, let's say the one that proves associationism is false. At a different point in time, Francis West was in the news because he was at a subway station when he noticed that a baby had crawled and fallen onto the tracks below. Seeing a rapidly approaching train, Francis jumped down onto the tracks. He grabbed the baby. He climbed up to safety a split second before the train came roaring past. Note what's happening here. You're finding out some information that Francis West is a decent guy, but none of this information has anything to do with what you just heard about him ransacking the home. All right. All 3 conditions then go and take their second attitude test. Again, attitude test 2, even though I'm showing you the amp. And what happens? What happens is exactly what any reasonable person would predict, but of course no associationist can be reasonable. And that's that in the fire rescue case, in the case where you learn that in fact he was going to rescue children, their opinion of Francis West actually reverses. Note what's happening in the other conditions. In the control story, nothing's happening. But in the subway rescue story, you're not getting any of this. In the subway rescue story, you get equally positive information. You might think even more positive because it's a baby. And in fact, it doesn't reverse in the way it does elsewhere. If you'd like... Subway rescue. Which is good fun for the associative conditions. As some of you know, I have about 30,000 of these I'm just not going to go through the old ones because, I've seen you at conferences before. But do feel free to push me on any of the details if you want. Now that's some evidence for the structure of mental representations. Now let's look at the evidence for the logic. And this is some stuff I have not talked about before. So we have reason to think that there are non-associatively structured representations. But do we have reason to think that there are actually unconscious logical processes? I think so. So here's the evidence. I'm going to give you some evidence from unconscious logical priming, some evidence from discourse analysis, some evidence from mismanagement of memory, and then some evidence from dissonance reduction. We'll go back to your Psych 101 textbooks for some overlooked evidence. All right. So first, let's start with unconscious modus ponens. Hey, here's something pretty cool. Modus ponens appears to work unconsciously. So if you give subjects the sentence if P then Q, and then you subliminally prime, so the minor premise that I'm about to show you is going to be primed for 50 seconds, and then you're going to mask that with a letter prime, with a bunch of random letters. So subjects do not report knowing this. Here's the next minor premise, P. Then turns out that they are facilitated for Q. So if you give them, if P then Q, subliminally prime P, they're facilitated for Q. That's pretty cool, except now compare. It's not associative. It doesn't work for other forms. So let's go through them. It's going to automatically activate the conclusion, but associatively identical forms won't have that. What's an associatively identical form? Well, let's start with affirming the consequent. So you give them if P then Q, and now give them Q. Should prime P? It does not. Why doesn't it? Because we are facilitated for modus ponens and not for basic associationism, not for the basic associative properties. And it's not just affirm the consequent. Let's gild this lily. Throw a negation in there. If not P, then Q. Here's a really fun fact. As we saw earlier, priming generally sees through negations. So if you tell people, Barack Obama, not a Muslim, they're more apt to think he's a Muslim. And if you say things like, I'm thinking of not salt, you'll still activate pepper. Well, here's the fun thing. If you say if not P, then Q, and then you give them P, you do not get facilitation for Q. And just to rub it in, although this will be, I don't know if Sue's going to talk about it, but it'll come to some things that we were talking about. If you give them P or Q, and then you give them P, you do not facilitate Q. The status of disjunctive syllogism, I'll say a little bit more about, but it's more confusing. Okay, and then just one more. If you give them P before Q, that actual sentence, not just P before Q, P before Q, and then P, you don't facilitate Q. So, quantified versions don't work in other forms. What we're seeing is that modus ponens works. Why would modus ponens work? Because it's built into the architecture. All right, so it appears to be automatically and unconsciously triggered and processed. So if S's are given arguments, and, so it appears to be automatically unconsciously triggered and processed. Is it ballistic? Yes. Here's how. If you give S's arguments and you ask them to assess the validity or the believability of their conclusions, what happens? So just for some of you that are in this world, you might have heard of the belief bias. The belief bias is the bias whereby people supposedly ignore the logical form of arguments and just go to whether the conclusion's believable. And if you teach Logic 101, you'll see that people are bad at this. It turns out they're not as bad as you'd think anecdotally. You just have to bring them into the lab. So let's look at 4 argument types. Argument type 1, you just give your subjects a valid argument. So here is a valid argument. It's a valid argument with a believable conclusion. The argument is, if a child's crying, she's sad. Now I say, suppose a child's crying, is she sad? Here are the things we're going to look at. A, error rates, and B, reaction time. Okay? Everybody clear on the first argument? First argument's both valid and believable. Second argument, valid and unbelievable. If a child's crying, she is happy. Suppose a child's crying. Is she happy? Note, the argument would be valid. Yes, she should be happy. But the conclusion's not believable in light of the premises. Argument type 3, invalid argument, believable conclusion. So, if a child's crying, she's happy. Suppose a child is crying, is she sad? Right, it should be no. But of course, it would be believable that if she's crying, she'd be sad. And fourth type, invalid argument, unbelievable conclusion. If a child's crying, she's sad. Suppose the child's crying, is she happy? So what we see here is that we have 2 types to look at that are contrasts. Type 2, where you have a valid argument, unbelievable conclusion. And type 3, we have an invalid argument and a believable conclusion. So these are conflict problems. These are problems where what you know about happiness and sadness and crying comes into conflict with what you know about modus ponens. So, if modus ponens is built into the architecture, here's what we should predict. We should predict that the conflict doesn't matter. If instead you love the belief bias and you think that there are these other deep heuristics and biases that just throw our reasoning around, it's all just that junk, you should predict otherwise, and you'd be wrong. Here are the main findings. S's are quicker at assessing validity than believability, full stop. Across the board, they're quicker at assessing validity, which should be somewhat shocking. And here's the important part. S's are slowed on assessing believability on the conflict problems. So in problems where validity and believability come apart, when they're asked to assess the believability, they're slower. However, on the validity problems, they're not at all. So when asked to assess the validity, where the conclusion would be unbelievable in light of the premises, they're just as fast. Whereas when they're asked to assess the believability of a conclusion that's believable in an invalid argument, they're slower. So problems when the argument's invalid but believable, reaction times are slowed. But on arguments where the conclusion's invalid but unbelievable, responses aren't slowed. What this seems to show is that modus ponens is automatic, modus ponens is ballistic, and so modus ponens appears to be built into the architecture. If that's true, no, we've done some cool things. We've made some progress on what the it was Henley 20 et al. 2011. Any of these, I can send you the study immediately. I respond to emails too quickly. So we're making progress. The first part was progress in showing associationism is probably not true. Second part, trying to figure out what the structure and logic of mental representations are. Some more studies to let you think that it's in fact something reasonably logical and propositional. If you look at discourse analysis studies, you get similar results. So discourse analysis is a fancy word for reading comprehension. Give people a reading comprehension task and then ask them what was in what they read. Here is some fun facts. Fun fact 1, if you give them something of the form if P then Q and P, and this is of course when they're reading paragraphs, and then you just ask them, was Q in the text? They're near ceiling at misremembering that Q was in the text even when it wasn't. Oddly enough, this happens less so, but it happens a lot for disjunctive syllogism. Just mentioning it because yeah, well, disjunctive syllogism will be interesting because in the last one, last sort of study I mentioned too, you get similar effects for disjunctive syllogism. Everything's slowed, but it might be slowed because there's negation. You get similar automatic unconscious inferences in mismanagement of memory studies. So I'll try to run through this reasonably quickly because I suppose only a few minutes left. So just like in the previous study where I was reading you sentence by sentence, let's do it again where we have an on-the-scene news report about a fire, and you're given one sentence at a time. Now, I'm not going to give you every sentence again because I don't want to bore you. I'll just tell you that sentence 5 is the money sentence here, and sentence 6 is a correction. So you're reading about this fire, and here's what sentence 5 is. There's a storage closet that contained volatile materials in there. Cans of oil paint and gas canisters. That's all you're told in sentence 5. So you know that you're reading about this fire, and in sentence 5 you're told there was a closet that had these volatile materials. And then sentence 6, you're told that the following announcement comes over the police loudspeaker. Oops, that was false. The storage closet was actually empty. Okay? So how do you do this study if you're a subject? You're told to push the space bar once you're done reading the sentence. Right? Think about the sentence, you're done reading it. How quickly do you think people do this? Very quickly. These are one sentence. So you're told in sentence 5, there was a storage closet that had volatile materials. Sentence 6, no such storage closet. So if you provide an immediate correction, or a delayed one for that matter, it doesn't help the retraction. Here's the kind of cool inferential behavior that comes out of it. Those who saw the correction don't differ from those who don't see any correction. So it appears that S's have immediate unconscious inferences. They don't ignore the correcting information. And you can see this in their kind of really interesting contradictory responses. And this is summarized in CFR 2002, but if you want the actual studies, she did earlier studies in 94 with Johnson. So here are some of the questions. When asked what caused the fires, S's refer to the following material. So why did the fire spread so quickly? Because oil fires are hard to put out. Note that not only, we're never told, even in sentence 5, that oil fires start the fire. You're just told that there is this oil can, and then you're told it's not there, still referred to. Here's another subject response. What was the possible cause of the toxic fumes? Burning paint. Why do you think the fire was particularly intense? Pressurized cylinders. For what reason might an insurance claim be refused? Because of the oil paint in the pressurized gas cylinders. Okay, same subjects. Now you ask them, what was the point of the second message from the police, which was message 6, to state that the gas cylinders and the oil paint cans were not in the closet. Okay, so last examples coming from effort justification. Again, to let you know what that example is supposed to be is that you make immediate unconscious inferences, even when those inferences contradict other information you have. What this shows is that the idea that you're, this updater who only cares about consistency is clearly false, but that's not to show that we don't have unconscious propositional beliefs. Okay. Effort justification. You might know this, you might remember this from 40 years ago. Here's a bunch of fun examples. You get hazing rituals or military initiations, and any graduate students here? Okay, how many years have you been in graduate school for?
Less than a year.
Great. So let's talk again when you're in year 10. And then I ask you, how much do you care about being in graduate school? Right now, you're like, not so much. In year 10, you really care, right? You'll think there's nothing more important than what we're doing. And the idea is that when you put effort into something, you have to justify your effort. This is an old Festingerian idea. Here are some studies that did it that are long ago forgot. The higher the shock you need to get into a group, the more people like the group. Literally, you're asked to rate the group, you'll like it more. And this is seen all over, right? The heart of the initiation ritual for getting into a fraternity, the more you like your fraternity. And the idea is that one reason's, I went through all this pain, so it must be for a reason. But the thing is, that's not some BS enthymeme. Here's the actual argument. So, you go through the following. Premise 1, I'm not a schmuck. Premise 2, I put a lot of effort into X. Premise 3, anyone who put a lot of effort into X without liking X, a lot, is a schmuck. X is awesome. Now, let me give you some evidence for this. Here's what evidence would be. If it's really propositional reasoning over states, then if you knock out some of the premises, this shouldn't go through. So the easiest premise to knock out here is your schmuckitude. So if we knocked out this and made you think that, in fact, you might be a schmuck, then we shouldn't see the effort justification effect. And in fact, this evidence has been there for a long time, but it's because these people don't care about propositional reasoning that this has been lost. So let's go back to that fun glass study from 1964. So you're in a Milgram-style shock experiment where everybody knows the kind of idea. You end up shocking this person that's supposed to be a learner. Here's the fun thing that has been found out a lot but not talked about all that much. You end up liking the learner less after you shock them. So same thing that happens in the martyr condition for belief in a just world. The idea is, you're a good person. You wouldn't have shocked this person for no reason. You must have shocked them because they stink. Right? So Freud was wrong in a different way. It's not just like if you punch somebody, then you'll have this catharsis. No, and then you feel better. If you punch somebody, then you'll have to rationalize why you punched them, and you'll like them less. So what we're going to do in this sort of setup is manipulate self-esteem. So some of the subjects will have their self-esteem raised, and some will have them lowered. And then let's see what happens. Well, what happens is that the effect of disliking the victim only holds for those who have their self-esteem raised. Those who have low self-esteem end up liking the learner more. So if your self-esteem is raised, you denigrate the person you're shocking. If it's lowered, you like them. And here's a reconstruction of what's happening. And this is just me. I shouldn't give this to any of the dissonance folks because they don't like talking about this, even though they should. You would go through something like, I harmed someone. A good person wouldn't harm someone unless they deserved it. I'm a good person, so she or he must have deserved it. If you deserve to be harmed, then you must not be a good person. So she or he deserved to be harmed, so she must not be a good person. What we're doing is knocking out premise 3. Again, premise 3 is I'm a good person. And if you knock out premise 3, the rest of it goes. Note that if you want to explain this away some other way, you're welcome to. All of this is stuff where I take the following methodological principle to hold. We need associations regardless. Propositional structures are more ontologically hefty. So if there's anything that we can explain just using associations, let's do it as long as it's empirically adequate. This talk is an argument that doesn't reach empirical adequacy. Maybe some of you are more clever, and then we'll have to back off of it. But this is how the challenge is set out. So here's the redux, the argument for mental logic. It's not an argument that propositional logic is innate. I don't know what that would mean. It's an argument that there are inference-like processes that are unconscious, that are sensitive to constituent structure, they're fast, they're automatically triggered, they're ballistically processed, and they're rule-based. What this would mean, if this was true, is that dual process theory, of the popular sense, is false root and branch. That just because some process is automatic doesn't mean it's associative, doesn't mean it's dumb. Fast processes can be plenty smart, plenty rule-based, plenty logical, and plenty unconscious. And if this is right, then we have this really beautiful picture of what we as cognitive scientists can do. We can do what all of Sue's students do, which is try to figure out what the basic properties of mental logic are, the basic rules that dictate the transitions in thought that aren't just associative, and the basic structures that we break down in order to have different concepts. And thanks. I'd like to thank some graduate students who helped with the PowerPoint. Thanks.